So today we are basically continuing with the topic of research methods, and today we're going to look at the types of studies that are used to actually obtain or gather information. So when we're actually conducting a research study, a lot of the time people think, oh, studies in psychology are all about experiments, but not necessarily. Okay, so when you're doing a research, or when you're investigating some variables or some research question there, you don't necessarily always have to do it in the form of an experiment. Okay, experiments are just one type of study that we use. A lot of the time, though, when we talk about other types of studies, these studies don't just exist within themselves. So we don't just say, okay, I'm going to do an observational study. We don't just say, okay, I'm going to do a case study. Usually what happens is these other studies contribute to an experiment or help us to find more results for another bigger experiment we might be doing. So although we do differentiate between things like case studies and experiments, we say that often these other types of studies that we are going to look at today help us to obtain extra information and extra results and extra findings for a bigger experiment or bigger research investigation that we might be doing. And so they're just as important for us to know. So according to the VCAR study design, there are obviously many different types of studies that we could use, but VCAR only specifies a few types. Okay, so the first one is cross-sectional studies, case studies, observational studies, and self-reports. And self-reports, within self-reports, you've got questionnaires, interviews, and rating scales, which we'll look at today. So these, basically these four types of other studies actually help us to obtain the results that we need when we conduct an experiment. And a lot of the time, if you look at a psychology researcher who's conducting an experiment or conducting an investigation, they will use one or more of these approaches to maybe obtain information. Okay, I think when you guys went on your zoo excursion last year, you guys did something, I think, similar to an observational study. Okay, and you were gathering data for the bigger research poster thing that you guys were doing at that point. So again, whenever you conduct research, you're not always just doing an experiment in and of itself. You are referring to other types of studies to help you to obtain those results or obtain extra information. Yes, this PowerPoint is on the school box. It's under the week 5 tile. Okay. And it's obviously just like we evaluated the research designs where we looked at advantages and disadvantages, we need to look at advantages and disadvantages for these 5 other types of studies as well. Okay, so these are called types of studies. So if I ever ask you to identify one type of study other than an experiment, you'd name one of these. All right, so let's have a look now at the actual types of studies. Now, the first one is a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study is a really straightforward study. It's basically comparing different groups of participants on one or more variables of interest at a single point in time, thus giving us a snapshot of what a person's behavior or thoughts or feelings are looking like at that point in time. Now, this definition might seem a little bit confusing or ambiguous, but basically what it is that it's me, if I'm like a researcher and I'm like, okay, I want to look at the levels of stress in high school students, shown in this diagram here. So if I want to look at the stress levels of high school students in 2020, after the whole corona situation, and I come into school in maybe August or September, I look at the stress levels in year 7 students. I ask year 8s, I ask year 9s, up to year 12. And each of those different groups now is a different cross-section of the population. So what I'm basically doing is that by asking the year 7s about their stress levels, I'm getting a snapshot of what their stress levels, what their feelings and thoughts and behavior kind of look like in 2020 with reference to stress, because that's the variable I'm measuring. That's my variable of interest. At that single point in time, in the definition here, the bold part, means that I'm measuring them in 2020. Okay, whenever we do cross-sectional studies, we don't have a range. We don't say, okay, I'm going to measure stress levels from 2007 to 2029. It's a single point in time, which means it's a specific time period, which we can actually pinpoint as 2020, 2018, 2019. Okay, so basically that's what a cross-sectional study is. It divides the population into different sections, and then you're basically studying each of those sections, each of those sections kind of separately, and each one is giving you a little snapshot or summary of behavior or mental processes. Now, you might think that this kind of reminds you of something else we've studied. It probably reminds you of stratified sampling. The only difference is that in stratified sampling, we're actually selecting participants from this group. But in cross-sectional studies, we're simply studying the behavior of each of the participants in that group. Okay, and that we could have huge numbers. So we could be studying all the 120 year 12 students or all the 160 year 7 students. We're not picking people out of that sample. Okay, so that's what a cross-sectional study is. It's just studying each of the cross-section of that population. And a lot of the time, it's usually used to study age-related differences, okay? So studying the age, it could be a very small age range we're looking at. So comparing year 12s, which are like 17 to 18-year-olds, with year 7s, which might be like 12-year-olds, okay? We're just studying the differences in age. Or we can also use cross-sectional studies to actually assess bigger differences in terms of age. So if you look at a family and you look at, okay, I want to study the age differences, age-related differences in terms of quality of life with reference to, you know, a 75-year-old, and compare that to what quality of life means for a 12-year-old and maybe a 10-year-old and then maybe an 8-year-old. Okay, so what you're doing is you are basically studying age-related differences with reference to that specific variable of interest. Now, don't confuse cross-sectional studies with longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies are like you study one person when they may be 7 years old and you follow them throughout their life until they reach maybe 80 or 60 years old of life. And you're basically following the same person. That's not what cross-sectional studies are. Cross-sectional studies are studying groups of people for a specific point in time. Yep, I see you in 2020, and after that, I don't care about you because I just wanted to know what you were feeling about this variable in 2020, okay, a single point in time. Now, what are the advantages of cross-sectional studies? Advantages are, number one, it's really cheap to do these studies. You know, I can just walk into any school after getting an approval, or any university, or any kind of, you know, organization, and I can just survey the different people of different ages. Okay, it's not hard to do, and it's cost effective. It can be set up and conducted quickly, which means that it's not really time consuming to do this. You just need to get the approval in terms of like which organization you're going to be kind of looking at the participants from. And the last thing is, because it's so cost effective and because it's not time consuming, because you're not wasting the participants' time, there's a lower chance of participant attrition. And participant attrition basically means there's a lower chance of the participants dropping out because they get bored, or because they get tired of the study, or because they just think it's dragging on for too long. Some of the disadvantages of cross-sectional studies, though, are, number one, if I'm studying this family of people, and basically I can't expect that a single variable will be defined in the same way for all of them. This grandma might have gone through the Great Depression. She might have lived through such hardships. Whereas for these kids, maybe their biggest hardship was, I don't know, like not getting the latest iPhone or something. So it's like you can't really always measure the same variable like stress levels or perceptions of stress, and you can't expect that to be the same for different age groups, okay? Because all of these different people from different age groups have grown up in different environments. They've been raised with different qualities of life, and they might have experienced really like significant differences in terms of hardships that they had to go through or struggles that they had to go through. Okay, so obviously something called the cohort effect comes up, and that cohort effect means that it depends on the variable that you're examined with. Depending on the variable that we're examining, we can have vast differences in terms of behavior that might be as a result of other variables that are not necessarily the IV that we're examining. Okay, so in 2020, this grandmother might be stressed, but she might not be just stressed because of 2020's corona situation. She might be stressed because it brings back memories of her living through, I don't know, the plague, or living through like other similar pandemics. Okay, so obviously then becomes difficult for us to separate what is the effect of the IV and what is the effect of some other confounding variable there. Also, for other variables like physical ability, physical health, and all that stuff, we can't always expect all age groups to show the same performance. If I'm going to assess sleep quality as a result of technology usage, it's not fair for me to assess that for different age groups, because we know naturally older people don't sleep very well, whereas younger kids tend to sleep quite well in comparison to older people. Okay, so again, depending on the age group you're assessing, it might necessarily not be fair to measure certain variables just because of the age differences. Is that all clear to everybody, or are there any kind of like questions or confusions? Because I know this topic wasn't covered in depth last year. It's just one of those topics we want to make sure we do cover properly though.
Miss?
Yeah?
Can you give an example of this, or like what kind of study can be used in?
Yeah, so if I'm studying, for example, let me think. So if I'm studying something like, if I'm a researcher and I'm studying the impact of technology usage on academic performance, and if I then take a cross-section of the population, so I decide, okay, I'm going to take a bunch of participants aged between 20 to 25, 30 to 35, 40 to 45, 50 to 55, and 60 to 65. And I've basically sectioned out, or I've put those different age groups into different sections or groups. Now, it's not fair to do a study like this, because what I will then be asking everyone to do is I'll be asking them to maybe use some kind of technology to conduct an online quiz, or maybe to complete an online assessment. Now, we can't expect that all 60 to 65-year-old people in that particular age group will be really confident with using technology. Whereas the 20 to 25-year-olds, the younger ones, are going to be really confident with using technology. So then it doesn't really become this concept of how well do you do the test as a result of the technology, but the fact that some of these people have had prior experience with using technology, whereas these older people have no experience with using technology. So rather than technology confidence being the reason for them doing well on the assessment, it's the prior experience with the technology that starts to affect that person's performance. So one person doesn't have experience, whereas the other person has too much. So another variable other than the IV starts to affect the DV or the results. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's all right. Okay, so that's basically what a cross-sectional study is. Remember, a cross-section is always, you're like taking a big thing and you're basically cutting it up into different sections, okay? And you're looking at each of those sections or each of those groups that you've now allocated. Cross-sectional studies are more often than not always used in reference to age. So if you ever get a case study that talks about dividing participants into different age-related groups, that could be a sign that cross-sectional studies are used.
And the results collected at the time, right?
Yes, and these results are collected straight away. Like I said, it's not a time-consuming study. In fact, this is like just one thing a person might use as a part of conducting a broader experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, got it.
Cool. The next one we're doing is quite familiar. We've done this, you guys have done this quite in-depth, I think last year, case studies. Okay, case studies are just an in-depth investigation where the researcher makes detailed observations of an individual over a period of time. We can also apply case studies to small groups of people. So when social psychology researchers, for example, were studying the social behaviors of groups that are not very common, so groups like Mormons or groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they were trying to study the personality characteristics of people in these groups. And so a lot of the time we can conduct case studies, not just on individuals like Phineas Gage or HM or, Jeannie the feral child, but we can also, complete case studies on groups like the Ku Klux Klan or a group of specific people that were involved in the Jonestown massacre. Okay, all of those things are things that we can do with reference to case studies. So obviously we've done heaps of case studies last year and this year. The most prevalent one we did this year was the HM with reference to memory, but you guys did some last year as well with reference to Phineas Gage, with reference to Jeannie, with reference to Sperry and Gazzaniga's split brain patients as well. Okay, so one of the advantages of case studies is, number one, they allow us to generate a lot of detailed information because you're studying the same person or the same group of people over that period of time. The disadvantage though is that case studies, because you're studying that same person extensively, they're really time consuming, number one, and you cannot generalize those findings back to the population because not every 12-year-old girl will be like Jeannie in the population. Okay, she's a unique case, she's a rare example, and we barely saw any other example of a kid that turned out like Jeannie after her case. So obviously we can't generalize those results because she does not represent the sample. Okay, she doesn't represent the general population. However, we can learn from what she went through, okay? And a lot of what we know about critical and sensitive periods in development and learning actually come from her case study. Okay, so that's what case studies are. And we also use case studies to sometimes generate a bit of data for a broader experiment we might be doing. Observational studies. So observational studies are obviously observing somebody doing something and then noting down the consequences of those actions. So this should be familiar to you from when we did observational learning in chapter 5. Okay, it's not just a simple case of monkey see, monkey do. It's more of like monkey sees what happens to the person who did what they did, and then monkey do. Okay, so it's like you always note down the consequences of the actions that you've observed before you do them yourself. Okay, especially as humans, we're not so stupid to just blindly do what other people do. We always see, okay, did she get in trouble for that? Did he get in trouble for that? What was the consequence? And if it was a positive consequence, then yes, we are more likely to imitate the behavior that we have observed. Now, there are two main types of observation that you guys would have studied last year as well. And those are naturalistic observation and controlled observation. Now, naturalistic observation has the word natural in it. So obviously it's like a natural setting. It's a real life setting. So if I want to study, if I'm a researcher and I'm interested in studying how children form friendships in kindergarten, okay, I might go to an actual kindergarten, maybe pretend to be one of the kindergarten teacher's assistants, and I might just like look around and watch the children kind of playing, watch the children interacting in that natural setting of their kindergarten. Naturalistic observation is really good because it means that the kids are not like, oh my God, I'm in a lab. Oh my God, how am I supposed to act? There's no kind of expectations, and the kids act in a really natural, genuine way. Controlled observation, on the other hand, is when you as a researcher can have a lot of control over the behavior that happens, because that behavior happens within a structured setting like a lab or a classroom or a school or a university, somewhere where there is some structure and it's not natural for that person to be in that environment. So if I take those kindergarten students and I take them to my lab, and I'm like, okay, guys, just play how you would normally play. Or if I put them in the lab and just see what they do, because it's a new environment, they're not going to respond naturally. They're going to be like, why are there so many, blank walls around me? Where are the posters? Where are the toys? Even if I give them a box of toys, because it's a new environment, they might feel a bit hesitant to maybe roam around or to act naturally. Okay, so one advantage obviously is of observational studies in general is that we can note down a behavior and consequences as they occur naturally in a person's environment, okay, given that we're using naturalistic observation. The disadvantage of observational studies is that if a participant knows that they're being observed, they will often change their behavior. So, this is one of the big problems of observational studies, that there's a lot of participant expectations. There's a lot of placebo effect that can occur when we have an observational study. So for example, if a researcher comes up to me and is like, oh, hey, Fareen, today I'm going to be, today I'm looking for participants to participate in my study. Do you want to participate? It's about healthy eating, okay, the impact of junk food advertising on healthy eating. And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll participate. Like, when are you going to start? And they're like, oh, next week. And I'm like, okay. So then next week, usually maybe I'm eating like super junk food every day. The next week I'm bringing like salads, I'm bringing like carrots and dip, I'm bringing all these healthy snacks because I want to kind of impress the researcher. I want to show them that, hey, I want to give you good results. I want to make sure that, you are able to make a good conclusion out of your study. And maybe I'm just doing that to impress the researcher, to show the researcher that I'm not just like some fat slob who just eats junk food every day. So essentially what we're trying to do with observational studies is we are trying to make sure that the participant doesn't know that we're observing them, okay? If they know we're observing them, they will definitely change their behavior. And, whenever someone's watching you, you don't act naturally. You always kind of like get a little anxious. You always change your behavior, even unconsciously or consciously, okay? Sometimes it might happen unconsciously as well. So that's what an observational study is about. And remember, we do use observational studies as part of bigger experiments. So to conduct a bigger experiment, like what you guys did last year with the whole zoo excursion and that observational study you did there. Yes, no.
So yeah, we're talking about disadvantages.
Yeah.
Can we also talk about the experimenters being the biased one himself?
Yes, correct. That's called observer bias. Yeah, that's called observer bias. So observer bias is like, I might be, maybe when my researcher is observing my behavior, if I'm eating like maybe a slightly kind of healthy food, like maybe a chicken burger, they might kind of note that as being a healthier chicken burger than like a normal chicken burger that you can buy from Macca's or somewhere else. So yeah, observer bias can exist.
Yeah, and then that can affect the
Yes,
studies.
that can also affect, and that can be a disadvantage as well. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Alrighty, so the next one we look at is really straightforward. It's called self-reports. Self-reports are used extensively when we are trying to obtain information for a study. If you Google any psychology research study or any psychology article that has been published, it will almost always have some form of a self-report in it. They ask the participants about the responses. They get the participants to respond to a set of questions. They interview the participants to ask how they're feeling, okay? Self-reports are extensively used in psychology and are probably one of the most significantly used out of all the ones we're covering today. So a self-report, simply defined, is a participant's written or spoken responses to any kind of questions, instructions, statements, whatever that is presented by the researcher. Okay, so self-reports, it's important to remember that it's not always written. I can ask a participant some questions and I can just record them speaking, okay? And that record or that recording can actually help me to obtain data for my study. That can be used as a set of data that helps me to, find some more information for my study. Self-reports often use questionnaires, interviews, and rating scales. So we can divide self-reports into being questionnaires, interviews, or rating scales. And obviously, the main goal, regardless of which method we use here, is to understand what is the participant's experience. How is the participant feeling? What is the participant's perceptions or views or perspectives with reference to that specific topic of research interest that we're looking at? So in general, one of the advantages of self-reports is that they are extremely detailed. They give us a lot of rich information of a personal nature from the participant. But whenever you're working with information that is personal in nature, that is subjective, we know that it always opens up this avenue for bias, okay? Bias happens and the participant might overestimate themselves. They might be overconfident about their ability to make new friends. For example, with those kindergarten children, if I ask a kindergarten child, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you think you can make friends? And they say, oh, me, 10 out of 10, I make friends all the time. But then when you're actually observing them, it's like, okay, maybe not. So, a lot of the time participants might be overconfident about their abilities, and there are just as many participants who might be underconfident about their abilities as well. Okay, so that can actually really skew or affect the reliability of results sometimes. When we're talking about another advantage of self-reports, another advantage is that it doesn't always have to be conversational based or in terms of verbal information. We can ask participants to give a number. So out of a percentage of 0 to 100%, with 100% being most stressed, what would you describe your stress level as being? This particular, oh my God, someone is at my door. Anyway, whatever. Okay, so then, on a scale of 0 to 100%, how stressed do you feel? And if you give maybe 80%, then it would suggest that you are kind of moderately stressed. Okay, so we can use both qualitative and quantitative data to basically, get some information from the person. That's the advantage. The disadvantage, if you were looking at this comic here, is that sometimes we can be overconfident with our particular abilities or skills or characteristics. Sometimes our responses can be biased as a result of that. Our responses can be inaccurate. Participants can lie about certain information or certain questions. And sometimes when participants are reading through questions in a questionnaire or someone is interviewing them, if they don't understand the question or if the question is worded in a really weird way, the participants might be less comfortable to say, oh, actually, you know what, can you explain the question to me? Or, you know what, I didn't really understand that word in that question. And they might just answer some really answer in a very ambiguous way, or in a way that they didn't mean to, but they couldn't actually understand the question to begin with. So this can also lead to invalid responses, okay? If you guys have ever done like a survey where you've had to choose like a number of options, a lot of the time you might get bored towards the end and you might just choose anything, okay? And there's actually a name for that as well that we're going to look at soon. Okay, so now we'll just move on to looking at the 3 different types of self-reports. starting with questionnaires. Now, a questionnaire is just a written set of questions. You might have done it. So it looks something like that. You've got the question, you've got to tick a box or write a response. Questionnaires are often conducted anonymously, which is good because participants tend to be honest, but which is bad because then if you leave a blank page, we don't know who left the blank page and we can't chase you up on it. Questionnaires are most commonly conducted through surveys. So when I got you guys to do that psych survey at the beginning of the year, that was an example of a questionnaire, okay? It can be completed online. Questionnaires don't necessarily have to be done with pen and paper. They are more and more being done online because it's easier for the researcher to email a link rather than print out the questionnaire and mail it to the person in person. Okay, so good thing about questionnaires is that they are easy to create. Again, they do include both qualitative and quantitative data. So I can put both mixtures of questions in, verbal-based and numerical-based. And questionnaires are really easy to conduct. You just give the person the link or you give the person the piece of paper and they start doing it straight away. You don't need any pre-knowledge or pre-reading to do it. And they're really easy to score and convert into percentages, graphs, or tables. The disadvantage, though, is very similar to the disadvantage of self-report in the sense that responses can be affected by bias. People might not understand what the question is asking from them and might be feeling awkward or feeling a bit shy to ask the researcher to explain it to them, okay? Because no one wants to look dumb in front of a researcher. So that's basically what a questionnaire is. Questionnaires are extremely common and extremely highly used when we do research studies, and they help researchers to obtain a lot of data about the participants' experiences. Interviews. Now, interviews are also done. They're not as extensively done as questionnaires because, again, interviews have to be done with the individual one-on-one, okay? They need to involve some kind of face-to-face meeting where you're sitting with your interviewee, like in this picture here, or they need to be done via the phone, okay? Now, a lot of the time, researchers or experimenters might not have a lot of time. Participants might be like, I don't have enough time to do an interview with you. So interviews are not as well used as questionnaires, but they are still important. And the reason that they're important is that we can obviously, when we're sitting with a person and doing an interview with them, we're kind of like allowing ourselves to have a more conversational tone, like, hey, how are you? What's going on? And stuff like that. So obviously the kind of format of interview that you choose, if it's structured, it's a little bit more structured, a bit more strict, a bit more formal. But if you choose to do an unstructured interview, it's almost like you're just having a conversation with that person. And as they get more and more comfortable, they might be happy to give you more details and more information about their feelings or about their experiences, okay, with reference to whatever the study is looking at. So most researchers, however, don't want it to be too casual and too conversational, so they tend to use a semi-structured approach, which is a mixture of both the formal plus the conversational style, okay, in one. Now, what's the good thing about using interviews? Well, it does allow for collection of data on sensitive issues. I'm not going to do a public questionnaire or a public, survey and ask this person about what their, bathroom habits are. That's like not something that we would do, okay? If it's some kind of sensitive information, maybe it's about a sensitive medical issue, okay? We don't want to make that public. So the best thing to do is to have an interview with that person one-on-one, where they know their information won't get leaked and they know that no one else is there to judge them except the researcher. Okay, researchers shouldn't be judging in the first place. Also, another advantage is that when you are speaking to a real person, you can infuse a lot of like friendliness and empathy and positive tone into your voice. And that can also help the participant to feel at ease compared to just writing on a piece of paper, which doesn't have a lot of emotion there. The disadvantage, however, is that as interviews require spoken responses, they can be time consuming. Participants might not be interested in wasting like an hour or 2 hours of their life speaking to a researcher. And for this reason, interviews are not often effective as well in terms of gathering data on large samples, okay? You can't expect a researcher to be able to call up 100 people in his study and interview each one of them one-on-one. It's not going to be practical, okay? So this is where questionnaires can sometimes be a little bit easier. That's interviews. And the last thing is rating scales. Now, rating scales, all of you would have done this in one way or the other. Usually after your Elevate sessions, they give you a survey. I think those have these kinds of questions on them. If you've ever been asked to do any kind of survey or give any kind of feedback form, you would usually see these questions on them, okay? Rating scales basically use fixed response questions that participants need to rank or rate. So they have got a number of options and they've got to basically select from a number of options there. So obviously, if your feelings towards protection of endangered species is something like, oh, I don't really care about that, you might tick number 2 here. Whereas if you think that it's more important, you might tick number 9. Okay, so obviously we all know how it works. It's pretty straightforward. Now this scale, which uses a five points, or like not important, slightly important, like 5 descriptive words there, is called a 5-point scale, specifically referred to as a Likert scale. Okay. An advantage of rating scales is they're quick, they're inexpensive to conduct. A lot of rating scales are inserted within questionnaires. Okay, so if you've got a questionnaire, they might insert a few of these rating scale type questions because they're easy to do. You just circle or you just click a box. You don't really need to write an essay or write a few sentences there. People love doing these because they're not time consuming, and your abilities, like in terms of literacy or written expression, won't affect your ability to respond to these as well. Also, they can be done online, and we can gather information and data from large samples of people. If I've got 300 participants in my study, I generate a link for the questionnaire that's got the rating scales in it as well, and I give it to my participants, and they're done within 10 minutes, and that's my job done, basically. Okay, so the disadvantage, however, number 1, laziness. Okay, if any of you have ever done pages and pages of these kinds of things, and I can say that I've actually done this myself, you start ticking the same box. Okay, so you go very important, just everything very important in one nice column, just keep ticking the same option. Okay, and obviously you're not reading the question at that point. Now, as participants, it doesn't matter to us, but as a researcher, that's kind of annoying. We call that the convenience bias, that people just tick whatever box they want that's convenient for them, whatever they feel like. Some people follow a pattern, so they go like diagonal, or, you know, they just choose whichever option they feel like. It's bad because then the researcher is getting a bunch of unreliable results, which are basically invalid, okay, because the participant didn't read the question properly. So that's what rating scales are about. Okay, rating scales are, again, used within questionnaires and are another type of self-report. Now, we have to remember that when we're using any type of study in psychological research, we are using different types of data to describe that study. The first thing that we need to remember is that data can be of 2 types. Primary data is data that is collected firsthand by the researcher. So if I'm a researcher and I'm studying how satisfied people are, or, you know, customer satisfaction with internet service provider. Okay, that's the example here. So I go up to people in my study and I'm like, okay, we're gonna have an interview. Please tell me what you feel, or how do you feel with your current internet service provider, Telstra? How do you feel with them? And then they start talking about it. I'm collecting that information firsthand. I'm doing the hard work. So basically that is called primary data, because you are the primary person, or you are the first kind of person to collect that data. Secondary data is when the data has already been collected and you're basically just studying that, or you're just linking that to your information or to your research study. So if I'm doing this study, rather than conducting these interviews with each person one-on-one and doing all the hard work, I go to Google and I look for, okay, data from 2020 relating to customer satisfaction with internet service provider. Click enter, and all the data from ABS, or the Australian Bureau of Statistics, comes up, and I take that and then I analyze that for my research study. That's what secondary data is. Secondary data is when someone else has done the hard work. You're simply taking that data or research and then analyzing it or linking it to your study. You would also know that data can be either descriptive, so really word-based or text-based, or quantitative, which means that it's numerical based. So again, data can be of qualitative type or quantitative type. Now, when we look at research for psychology, we can't say that one is more important than the other. Okay, both are equally important, and it's important for us to have a mixture of both quantitative and qualitative data as our, you know, points of data that we use for our investigation. Yeah, so for secondary data, we can use that as resources. So when you guys, for example, did your poster project last year, you might remember Miss B or Miss Amina maybe asking you to collect some, you know, go online and find some research papers relating to this topic. When you find those research papers, that is an example of secondary data. Because any information that's published online by someone other than you is not your work. You haven't done the hard yards to get that data. So it's just secondary data. Okay, it's data which has been collected by someone else, not by you. So that is basically secondary data. A lot of the resources that we use, that we obtain from the internet, are examples of secondary data. Okay. So yeah, that's basically what it is. And subjective and objective data are, again, subjective data is like self-reports where it's personalized but open to bias. It's all about the participants' thoughts and feelings. Objective data is more like numbers. So turning like, looking at the percentage, looking at the average time that teenagers sleep after having coffee. Okay, it's more like numbers. It's data that's less prone to bias, less prone to inaccuracy, because it's just numbers. You can't mess with numbers or make numbers biased. Okay, so that's basically the difference between subjective and objective. Yeah, so that's basically that particular slide there. I'm just gonna spend like literally 2 or 3 minutes now just going through descriptive statistics. I just want to tell you guys that you don't really need to, like, this is a super easy topic. All of you have done up to year 10 maths at least, so you all know what mean, median, and mode is. What is more important for you to understand is that descriptive statistics are a type of statistics that help us to describe the results. Okay, the word descriptive comes from the word describe. So these, when I have a mean number or a median or a mode, it's giving me some kind of description of what the results were trying to tell me. Okay, and usually when we have descriptive statistics, we basically refer to these three measures as measures of central tendency. They're measures of central tendency because they tell us the typical value or the typical characteristic of that item in a data set. So what I'm saying is that if I conduct a study and I get maybe 25 teenagers to document their sleep patterns over a period of 2 weeks in the lead up to VCE exams, and I say, okay, from this study, my mean sleep duration for the teenagers was 6.25 hours. That's not telling me that every participant in that study had a sleep of 6.25 hours. It's basically telling me that that was the average. Okay, so it's giving me a summary rather than saying, okay, participant 1 had this many hours, participant 2 had this many hours, and going on for like 2 hours straight about that information. I'm able to give you a single typical value which describes the general performance or the general duration of sleep for the teenagers in my study. And a lot of the time, because we are always worried about time and not everything not being too time consuming, mean is a really good way to summarize and describe your results without reading out your entire result sheet to a person. Okay. Now, remember, we cannot draw conclusions or generalization from a mean value, from a median, or from a mode value. We can only draw conclusions from p-values, but again, p-values have been removed. So you need to remember that only inferential statistics like p-values can help us to draw conclusions. Mean values have no bearing or no influence on our ability to make conclusions or generalizations. Now, basically, looking at what mean, median, and mode are, honestly, I've just put these definitions in for those of you who have forgotten what mean, median, and mode are, but I think it's pretty straightforward. Mean is the average of all scores or items. How to calculate the mean, you add up all the scores, you just divide by the total number of scores you've got. Okay, so I've just put an example there to make it like super clear. But yeah, that's basically what mean is. It's the average, okay? And it's a really good summary number or a summary indicator of what the typical results of the study were. Median is the number that occurs exactly halfway. A lot of the time, we're not super interested in the median as much as the mean, but the median can be good for us as an extra number. So a lot of the time, if we're not satisfied with just looking at the mean, we might look at the median as well, okay? The median is kind of showing us, again, a typical value there. And you all know how to calculate the median, so I'm not going to go into the maths of that. And the last thing is the mode. So the mode is the most commonly occurring score item in the data set. So if I'm like to the researcher, okay, you've told me that the mean or the average sleep duration was 6.25 hours, but I'm not happy with that. Can you give me your entire result sheet so I can look for myself? And if I look at the result sheet for myself and notice that 6.25 or 7 is the most occurring number in terms of hours of duration of sleep, that will then be the mode, okay? That's the most commonly occurring number, score, or item in that data set, Okay, modes are important because they do give us an insight into the most frequently selected response or the most frequently stated duration of sleep or whatever we're measuring. Okay, so sometimes, again, it's good to use the mode in conjunction to using the mean. And you guys know how to calculate mode. You just look at which number occurs most in a data set. Mode stands for most occurring number. Okay, so that's basically it. I'm not going to go into standard deviation today because I will have to explain this a little bit more. But standard deviation is just with reference to how far the scores vary or how far the scores deviate or travel away from the mean value. We will go into that next week, not today. I think that's enough for today. Alrighty, so that brings us to the end of today's session.